Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Lowy Institute. I'm Michael Fullilove, the Program Director for Global Issues. Here at the Institute, we often say it's a pleasure to introduce some speaker or other, but in my 6 years at the Institute, I've taken no greater pleasure from any introduction than I take today in introducing Graham Freudenberg AM. There are three reasons why it's such a pleasure to introduce Graham this morning. The first is that Graham is the Dean of Australian Speechwriters and Advisors. He looms large in the political history of late 20th century Australia. I've described Graham as Australia's Ted Sorensen, but in fact it's more accurate to say that Ted Sorensen is America's Graham Freudenberg. Sorensen is a genius and a hero of mine, but Sorensen only wrote for one head of government, albeit President John F. Kennedy. Freudy, by contrast, has written for 5 heads of government, 2 Prime Ministers, Gough Whitlam and Bob Hawke, and 3 Premiers of New South Wales. 2 of those Premiers, Neville Wran and Bob Carr, are with us today, and the third, of course, was Barry Unsworth. Graham has maintained tranquil relations with all of his bosses, and that trust, I think, rests on his discretion and his loyalty. We usually associate Graham with the big dramatic set-piece political speech such as the launch of the 1972 campaign at Blacktown Civic Centre, in which Gough and Graham caught the national mood for change. But the truth is, during his advisory career, Graham had an enormous amount to do with the issues that we deal with here at the Lowy Institute. Throughout the decade of our involvement in the Vietnam War, for instance, Graham articulated the response of the Australian Labor Party through the prism of the American alliance. And of course, he had a great deal to do with one of the most important documents in Australian foreign policy, Arthur Calwell's parliamentary statement of opposition to the war in 1965. That speech was anti-war without being anti-American. It refused to shrink the US-Australia alliance to the dimensions of a single conflict. And in so doing, it set the tone for Labor's thinking about the alliance. So that's the first reason. The second is that Graham is a great political historian in a country that produces many quickie biographies of political leaders, but few books which really do justice to the drama of Australian politics. His book on Whitlam, A Certain Grandeur, is a classic, soon to be released in a new edition which includes an original section on the Whitlam government's handling of East Timor. I strongly recommend to you Graham's marvellous autobiography, A Figure of Speech, and his latest book, Churchill and Australia, provides the subject matter for his address today in our Distinguished Speakers series, and he's going to be talking on the title Australasian Anxieties, How Winston Churchill Shaped Australia's Relations with Britain, Japan and the US for 6 decades. All of these books by Freudenberg are first-rate pieces of history, substantive, well-researched, with a clear narrative thread, a compelling argument, and of course, elegantly written. So that's the second reason. The final reason is that Graham has been a mentor to me and to many other speechwriters and speech geeks coming through the ranks. I read A Certain Grandeur when I first went to university, and I was very taken by it. He was unfailingly generous to me when I worked for Prime Minister Keating, and he has been ever since. He did me the compliment of writing the foreword for my collection of great Australian speeches, which had the Whitlam-esque title, Men and Women of Australia. Graham is a great writer, a wonderful historian, an invaluable corporate memory, but also a genuinely lovely human being. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, Graham, I hope you won't be offended at this, Graham is a great Australian institution, so we thought it appropriate that he address another great Australian institution, the Lowy Institute. In other words, Graham, it's time.
Thank you, Michael, for that very generous introduction. The fame, of course, is a variable quantity, as we has-beens know. And when, at the time that Michael was working with, is that all right? At the time that Michael was working with Paul Keating, I was invited to address the the students at Michael's alma mater, the North Sydney High, great school. And I thought the students would be interested in some of the great politicians I had contact with, from going back to Arthur Colwell, Bob Menzies, I might say, though I never wrote for Bob, and Gough and Bob Hawke and Bob Carr and Neville Wran, and so I spoke about that subject when the questions when it came time for questions. I thought they'd ask me some more detail on these great figures. But the first question, and almost the only question I got, was, "Sir, do you know Michael Fullerlove?" But I'm very honoured to speak to you today, and very grateful for such a great attendance. So thank you very much. After I got the idea for this book, Churchill and Australia, from Martin Gilbert's Churchill and America, I didn't set out with any agenda or to prove anything or to revise, attack, or to defend. As the great English novelist E.M. Forster said, "How do I know what I think until I see what I write?" 1,000 speeches started out that way. I set out to write a story. Churchill looms so large in the Australian story because he was by far the greatest imperial figure for much of the unfolding and at the climax of Australia's imperial chapter, a stronger and longer chapter than most of us care to acknowledge today. He personified the clash between Australia's imperial and national identity and interests from Anzac to Anzus. His ambivalence about Australia reflected his own ambivalence about the empire itself, and Australia's ambivalence about itself and its place in the empire. Now, Australian anxieties, which I've taken as a general text to my opening remarks, Australasian anxieties is the title Churchill gave to the chapter in his war memoirs dealing with the situation in the Pacific after Pearl Harbor. And the tendentiousness, as I now think, of this chapter provided me with considerable motivation as I got into this story, because it became clear that he had been very unfair to Australia, particularly to the Curtin government, and that he was astonishingly ill-informed about the nature of Australian party politics. But also I've long been struck by the readiness of Australian writers, not least the official war historians, to accept Churchill's strictures on Australia at their face value, particularly in their political aspects. In the big things, and above all, the thing that mattered most, the destruction of Hitler, this is not a revisionist book, but I do offer a corrective view of key aspects of Churchill's relations with Australia. I believe that one of the reasons why Churchill's one-sided accounts on a range of matters from Tobruk to Burma has been accepted for so long was his skill in distinguishing between the Australian soldier and the Australian politician. His unstinted praise for the one and his denigration of the other, the politicians, were equally gratifying to the Australian public. The other reason why Churchill's views were almost beyond criticism, particularly the views of the warm memoirs, which passed into posterity as the definitive account. The other reason why his views were almost beyond criticism was his rock-like reputation as the saviour of Britain. Now, I fundamentally accept that view, and the whole of the second section of the larger section of the book must be read with Churchill's contribution in saving Britain and Europe, and therefore the world, from Hitler, is really the moral compass of the work. Whatever major criticisms I may have of many of his decisions, but accepting that, I wonder whether the official historians like Gavin Long, Lionel Wigmore, and Paul Hasluck would have been so tender about many of Churchill's decisions affecting Australia if they had known the opinion of the chief of his own chief of the Imperial Staff, Sir Alan Brooke, who wrote in 1944 in his diary, his voluminous and illuminating diaries. Alan Brooke wrote, "The wonderful thing is that 3/4 of the world imagine that Winston Churchill is one of the great strategists of history, a second Marlborough, and the other quarter have no conception what a public menace he is and has been throughout the war. Without him, England was lost for a certainty. With him, England has been on the verge of disaster time and time again." Similarly, they might have been less accepting, those historians might have been less accepting if they had known that Churchill's greatest Australian champion, Robert Menzies, had written in his diaries in London in April 1941, "WC speaks at length as the master strategist. Tobruk must be held as a bridgehead from which to hit the enemy. With what, says I? The cabinet," that's the British cabinet, "is deplorable. Dumb men, most of them, most of whom agree with Winston, most of whom disagree with Winston, but none of whom dare say so." Menzies went on, "The chiefs of staff are without exception yes men. Winston is a dictator. He cannot be overruled. The people have set him up as something little less than a god, and his power is therefore terrific." So I felt quite emboldened by reading these comments in examining and then criticising many aspects of Churchill's strategic decisions, particularly affecting Australia. Now, Churchill entered the councils of empire at the very moment that Australian anxieties were changing focus. He became Parliamentary Under-Secretary for the Colonies in 1905, the same year that Japan won its epic victory over the Russian Empire, sealed by the naval battle of Tsushima. Up to then, our specific anxieties centred on the presumed Pacific ambitions of Britain's rival empires, the Russians, the French and the Germans. The rise of Japanese power in the Pacific meant, and I think inevitably, given the circumstances, given our geographical situation, it meant that Australian anxieties would be cast in terms of race. White Australia itself became a cause of anxiety about the empire and Britain's willingness to defend this part of it. The Sydney Bulletin was fairly typical when it wrote after the Japanese victory over Russia. If Australia isn't ready to fight for its White Australia policy, and if Britain doesn't care to take up the question, which, as the greatest nigger power on earth, it can hardly do with any enthusiasm, there is an end to White Australia, with its glories and its dreams and its unique opportunities. But whether it be fear of Russia, of France, or of Germany, or Japan, or the generalised threat from the vast populations to the north, there was one anxiety common to all. The anxiety that the imperial protector might be unwilling or unable to protect us. This was the great Australian anxiety. It has been the foundation of Australian and defence policy for well over a century. In fundamental respects, it remains so. Now, I don't use the term anxiety in any derogatory or dismissive or pathological sense. As a framework for policy, it can be likened to Britain's ruling doctrine for 400 years that no single great power should dominate Europe. The doctrine which was at the root of Churchill's warnings against Hitler in the 1930s. To be fair to Churchill, was never as dismissive about Australian anxieties, either in the early part of the century or in the 30s. Churchill was never as dismissive about Australian anxieties as the Whitehall officials and defence chiefs around him, going back to the early times when the Australian government was grappling with the task of creating its military force from scratch. The senior official at the Colonial Office, where Churchill was Under-Secretary, wrote, "I suppose so long as our fleet is supreme, the Australians can continue to play a game of soldiers under any rules they like." When Deakin raised for the umpteenth time since the 1880s his concerns about the Anglo-French agreement on the New Hebrides, the same official wrote to Churchill, "The Australians, who have never had to face any diplomatic difficulty, seem to think that we can treat France as if she were a Tonga or a Samoa. Dealing with France needs courteous people, able to speak, able to work with the French, and I doubt if any Australian will fulfil these requirements." English attitudes improved slightly over the next 30 years when the Australian Attorney General spoke in Westminster Hall in 1935. The London Times was able to comment, "Mr. Menzies is Australian born, but he speaks precisely in the manner of a cultivated Englishman." Churchill's approach for over 40 years never strayed far from the position he had adopted with his lifelong friend and sometime colleague, Leo Amery, on the eve of his clashes with Alfred Deakin at the 1907 Imperial Conference. Amery wrote, "Churchill's own idea seemed to be that the colonial prime ministers should be given a good time and sent away banqueted, but empty-handed. I found Churchill strongly opposed to any idea of consulting the colonies on foreign affairs, seeing no point in doing so until they were military powers whose alliance could be of any real value to us." At the same time, Churchill opposed Australia's efforts to create its own navy, which was intended not by any means as an independent force, but as a complementary addition to the strength of the Royal Navy in the Pacific. And this led to the first great clash between Australian anxieties on the one hand and Churchill's imperial imperatives on the other. And there's a marvellous symmetry about it, because the arguments and contradictions and expediencies of the next 30 years were compressed in this episode into one episode. From the time he became First Lord of the Admiralty in 1911, as the Bulletin described it, head of the British Shipping Department, Churchill sought to allay Australian anxieties about Japan in order to press forward his policy of concentration of the Royal Navy in the Atlantic. And that's why his general attitude to the Australian Navy, or the idea of an Australian Navy, was that our contribution should be, in money terms, to buy perhaps a dreadnought, which could be of use to the Royal Navy in the Atlantic, in the great battle then looming, as he came to believe, with Imperial Germany. Therefore, an Australian Navy, in Churchill's eyes, was an unnecessary and wasteful diversion of expenditure and effort. But in a speech in the House of Commons on the 17th of March 1914, Churchill was speaking on the naval estimates and pointing out the wastefulness of Australia trying to buy or build its own navy. And Churchill said, "If Japan chose to indulge in ambitions of empire or colonization in the southern Pacific, there are no means by which Australia and New Zealand can expect to maintain themselves single-handed. If the power of Great Britain were shattered on the sea in the Atlantic, the only course of the 5 million of white men in the Pacific would be to seek the protection of the United States." This is March 1914. Now, this prophecy became graven on the Australian political and collective memory, and John Curtin, for one, remembered it vividly. And going ahead to 1942, when Churchill reacted, and as I describe it in the book, in my belief, grossly overacted to Curtin's famous New Year's message, the turning to America, so-called. Curtin conceded to his Defence Department head, Frederick Shedden, that he, Curtin, regretted using in this message the words "free of any pangs as to our traditional links or kinship with the United Kingdom," and that he should have instead used the words irrespective of our, or without altering our traditional relationship with the United Kingdom. But Churchill stood by the thrust of his message, which was the turning to America. But he said to Shedden, "I'm in good company. I only said what Churchill said in 1914. Churchill's reaction and overreaction to this message has historically, I believe, made the turning to America seem much more abrupt and complete than it actually was. And I believe, and I tried to show in this book, that it was Churchill himself who made the Curtin's New Year's message such an issue. The essential thing about the Curtin's New Year's message is that it was being published. It was published in the Melbourne Herald on Saturday, the 27th of December 1941, and it was a message to the Australian people, not to the United States, not to Roosevelt. It was a message to tell the Australian people what the situation was, what they could expect, and how we would respond to the direful situation. It was a message to the people, not to the United States. And it was largely Churchill's reaction, I believe, gross overreaction, and I give the reasons why I believe that he did so overact, that made it a burning issue as between Australia and Churchill. And then I ask, did Roosevelt really say, as it's claimed by Dick Casey's wife, Casey being our ambassador, our minister in Washington, attached to the British Embassy, of course. Did Roosevelt really say, as claimed by Casey's wife May in one of her books, that the message, Curtin's message, smacked of panic and disloyalty? And if he did say it, if Roosevelt did say that, who other than Churchill could have put such an idea into his head? And who other than Churchill in Washington at the time could have made Roosevelt even aware of this message written for Australian home consumption?